9 languages? The millionaire said with a grin that spread across the polished mahogany table. That's cute. I hope one of them is the language of pouring coffee. Laughter rolled through the private dining room like a perfectly rehearsed performance. Crystal glasses chimed softly. Expensive silverware caught the warm glow of the chandeliers. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Manhattan skyline shimmered against the summer night, each tower standing like a monument to ambition. At the center of it all stood Naomi Brooks, a 27-year-old black waitress wearing a neatly pressed black uniform, a simple silver name tag, and the calm expression of someone who had learned long ago that silence often revealed more than words ever could. She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't force a smile. She simply adjusted the water pitcher in her hands as if the room had never laughed at all. The guests noticed her stillness more than they noticed the joke. There was something unusual about the way she carried herself. Not proud in the loud sense. Confident in the quiet sense. The kind of confidence that never asked permission to exist. Ethan Whitmore watched her carefully from the head of the table. At 39, he had built Whitmore Global Logistics into one of the fastest-growing transportation companies in America. Business magazines called him visionary. Investors called him fearless. Employees called him demanding when he wasn't around. Tonight, he wore a tailored navy suit worth more than some people earned in a month, a platinum watch that reflected the candlelight, and the unmistakable expression of a man who believed every room naturally belonged to him. This dinner wasn't simply another business meeting. It was the final negotiation before a partnership expected to exceed $1 billion over the next decade. Diplomats, executives, investors, and foreign delegates filled every seat around the table. Every sentence carried weight. Every handshake had consequences. Every mistake could become tomorrow's headline. Yet somehow, in a room full of people discussing global markets, advanced technology, and international expansion, the easiest target had become the woman quietly refilling their glasses. Ethan leaned back, swirling the sparkling water in his crystal glass before looking directly at Naomi again. So, he asked with amused curiosity, which 9 languages do you speak? Several guests exchanged knowing smiles. One executive quietly reached for his phone beneath the table, sensing entertainment rather than history. Naomi finally spoke, her voice gentle enough to lower the temperature in the room without raising its volume. English, Spanish, French, Italian, German, Japanese, Mandarin, Arabic, and Portuguese. Another wave of laughter swept across the dining room, louder this time. Someone whispered that she must have memorized the list from the internet. Another guest chuckled that ordering appetizers in 9 languages hardly made someone an expert. Ethan smiled politely, almost generously, as though he had just indulged an impossible dream. But Naomi's expression never changed. She neither defended herself nor challenged anyone. She simply nodded once and resumed her work, placing a fresh glass beside an elderly guest from overseas before quietly stepping back into the rhythm of service. No one noticed the distinguished visitor studying her with growing curiosity. No one noticed the subtle pause that crossed his face. And no one in that magnificent room realized that before the evening was over, the least powerful person at the table would become the only voice capable of saving everything they had spent years trying to build. Naomi Brooks had learned years ago that the world often made decisions before she ever spoke. Some people saw the neatly folded apron around her waist and assumed that was the entire story. Others noticed the color of her skin before they noticed the confidence in her posture. A few never looked at her at all. She had stopped trying to change first impressions because she had discovered something far more valuable. First impressions belonged to strangers. Character belonged to her. Every weekday began at 5:30 in the morning inside a modest apartment in Queens, where the sound of city buses replaced alarm clocks and sunlight slowly climbed across the brick buildings. Outside her kitchen window, before every shift, Naomi spent exactly 1 hour studying. One morning it was Japanese news broadcasts. The next it was business podcasts in German. Sometimes she practiced Portuguese pronunciation while making coffee. Other days, she copied unfamiliar Arabic expressions into a notebook whose pages had become worn from years of careful use. The notebook never left her backpack. It was more valuable than any expensive handbag because every page represented another promise she had made to herself. She had never attended an elite university. She had never traveled around the world. Her classroom had been public libraries, free online lectures, borrowed grammar books, language exchange calls, and countless evenings after exhausting double shifts when most people would have chosen sleep instead of another lesson. Her mother used to tell her that knowledge was the only investment nobody could ever take away. Even after her mother passed away from a long illness, Naomi repeated those words every time she opened another dictionary or learned another unfamiliar phrase. She was not collecting languages to impress strangers. She was collecting doors that might one day open when opportunity finally knocked. At the restaurant, however, almost nobody knew that story. To the kitchen staff, Naomi was simply dependable. She arrived 15 minutes early every shift. She remembered every reservation without writing it down. She noticed empty glasses before guests asked for refills. Managers trusted her because she never panicked during busy nights. Fellow servers admired her because she quietly helped everyone finish difficult tables before finishing her own. Still, guests rarely remembered her name. They remembered the wine. They remembered the steak. They remembered the view of Manhattan sparkling beyond the windows. Naomi understood that service often meant becoming invisible. She accepted that reality without bitterness because invisibility had become her greatest teacher. When people believed she was not worth noticing, they spoke honestly. They revealed who they really were. Across the dining room, Ethan Whitmore continued discussing international shipping routes with investors while confidence flowed through every sentence he spoke. He had spent his entire career believing expertise could be measured by titles, resumes, and executive offices. Tonight, he never imagined that someone carrying sparkling water instead of a leather briefcase might understand global communication better than half the people seated around his table. Yet the distinguished guest who had quietly observed Naomi moments earlier had not returned his attention to the negotiations. Instead, his thoughtful eyes followed her every movement through the room with growing curiosity, as though he had recognized something everyone else had completely overlooked. And before another course reached the table, he slowly closed the folder beside his plate, folded his hands together, and prepared to ask a question that would change the direction of the entire evening. The quiet lasted only a few seconds, but inside a room where billion-dollar decisions were made, a few seconds could feel like an eternity. The distinguished guest slowly lifted his glass, his thoughtful eyes never leaving Naomi as she approached to refill it. Unlike everyone else, he did not smile with amusement. He smiled with curiosity. His name was Victor Laurent, founder of one of the largest luxury hotel groups in Europe and the lead representative for the international consortium considering the partnership with Whitmore Global Logistics. He had negotiated contracts in more than 40 countries, built friendships across continents, and learned one lesson that years of success had taught him better than any business school ever could. The smartest person in the room was often the one nobody expected. As Naomi carefully poured sparkling water into his glass, Victor spoke softly in flawless French. It was not loud enough for anyone else to notice. It was not meant to embarrass her. It was simply a question. Naomi answered immediately in the same elegant French, matching his calm tone and natural rhythm so effortlessly that Victor's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. He nodded politely before switching to Italian without warning. Again, Naomi responded without hesitation, her pronunciation smooth enough to sound as though she had spent years living in Milan. Victor leaned back with growing fascination. Around the table, executives continued discussing market projections, completely unaware that an entirely different conversation had quietly begun only a few feet away. Ethan Whitmore noticed Victor's changing expression before he noticed Naomi's answers. The billionaire interrupted his own presentation with a confident smile. "Everything all right over there?" he asked, assuming his distinguished guest was simply complimenting the restaurant service. Victor looked toward Ethan and answered in English with measured composure. "Everything is excellent. I was simply having a conversation." Ethan chuckled. "I did not realize our servers offered multilingual consulting with dinner." A few guests laughed politely. Victor did not. Instead, he turned back toward Naomi and continued speaking, this time in Japanese. Naomi listened carefully, her eyes attentive rather than eager, then replied with respectful fluency that carried the quiet confidence of countless hours of disciplined practice. Victor slowly placed his glass back onto the table. The smile on his face disappeared, replaced by genuine admiration. For the first time that evening, nearby conversations began to fade as several international delegates realized what was happening. One executive from Brazil lowered his fork. Another guest from Germany stopped reading financial reports displayed on a tablet. Even the restaurant manager paused near the entrance, sensing an unexpected shift in the atmosphere. Ethan folded his arms, still convinced there had to be a simple explanation. Perhaps she had memorized common phrases. Perhaps Victor was making the exchange easier out of kindness. There had to be a limit. There always was. Success, after all, had taught Ethan that extraordinary claims usually collapsed under real pressure. Victor, however, seemed determined to discover where that limit truly existed. His voice remained calm as he changed languages once again, moving naturally into Portuguese before asking a more complicated question involving international commerce and cultural traditions rather than simple greetings. Naomi answered with thoughtful precision, even adding a polite expression commonly used in Lisbon that caused Victor to laugh warmly with surprise. It was not laughter meant to diminish someone. It was the rare laughter of a person delighted to discover something remarkable where everyone else had seen only ordinary. The room no longer sounded like a business dinner. It sounded like uncertainty. Conversations that had filled the private dining room only minutes earlier dissolved into scattered whispers. Crystal glasses rested untouched. Even the servers moving between tables instinctively slowed their pace, sensing that something unexpected had quietly taken control of the evening. Ethan Whitmore forced a confident smile, but confidence and certainty were no longer the same thing. He leaned forward, folded his hands together, and looked directly at Naomi. "That is impressive," he said with practiced composure. "But memorizing a few conversations is different from understanding a language." His words were polite enough to avoid offense, yet sharp enough to remind everyone who still held authority in the room. Several executives nodded in agreement. It was the explanation they wanted to believe. Extraordinary people belonged in executive offices, not carrying polished silver trays through a dining room overlooking Manhattan. Naomi simply inclined her head. "Perhaps," she answered calmly. There was no challenge in her voice, no frustration, no need to defend herself. Her quiet confidence somehow unsettled the room more than any argument could have. Ethan stood from his chair and walked toward the large digital presentation screen near the center of the room. "Our partners represent many countries," he announced with an easy laugh. "Maybe we should have a little fun before dessert." A few guests smiled uncertainly. Victor Laurent watched silently, saying nothing. Ethan invited delegates from different nations to ask Naomi questions in their native languages. "Anything you like," he said. "Business, culture, history. Let us see how far this remarkable talent really goes." The first question came from a delegate from Germany, about supply chain regulations across the European Union. Naomi answered fluently, even mentioning recent transportation policy changes that surprised the executive enough to make him nod with visible respect. A representative from Brazil followed with a question about regional customs during corporate negotiations in Sao Paulo. Naomi answered naturally, including a cultural detail that made the Brazilian guest smile with genuine appreciation. Then came Arabic, then Mandarin, then Japanese. Each answer flowed with the same calm rhythm, never rushed, never rehearsed, never searching for words. She spoke as though every language had become another window through which she viewed the same world. The room continued growing quieter after every exchange. Even the restaurant staff standing near the service entrance had stopped pretending not to watch. Ethan's smile gradually faded. He had expected hesitation. He had expected mistakes. Instead, every response only strengthened the growing realization that the woman everyone had dismissed possessed a level of discipline few people ever achieved in a lifetime. Yet Ethan still searched for a limit. "One more," he said, looking toward an elderly gentleman seated near Victor Laurent. The distinguished guest had remained almost silent throughout the evening, listening far more than speaking. Victor nodded respectfully toward him before introducing him to the room. "This is Professor Alejandro Mendez. He advises governments on international diplomacy. There is something unique about him. He prefers conducting important discussions in Galician because it reminds him of home." Several executives exchanged puzzled looks. Very few people around the table had even heard the language spoken before. Ethan relaxed slightly, convinced that the moment had finally arrived when reality would catch up with reputation. Professor Mendez smiled kindly at Naomi before asking an intricate question in the centuries-old language, speaking with the effortless rhythm of someone returning to childhood memories. Naomi listened without interrupting. She lowered her eyes for only a brief second, almost as if honoring the words themselves, before looking back at the professor with a warm smile that carried not confidence, but respect. Then she began to answer. Not a single person interrupted. The only sound left inside the private dining room was Naomi's steady voice as Galician flowed from her lips with quiet elegance, every sentence measured, every expression carrying the warmth and subtle rhythm that Professor Alejandro Mendez had not heard outside his homeland in years. His eyes widened before a slow smile spread across his face. When Naomi finished answering, the elderly professor remained silent for several seconds, studying her as though he had just uncovered something far more valuable than a successful business proposal. Then, in English, he spoke softly enough that everyone leaned forward to catch every word. "Young lady, that was not textbook Galician. That was the language of someone who understands our people." A ripple of astonishment swept across the room. Several international delegates glanced at one another, unsure whether they had just witnessed a coincidence or something extraordinary. Professor Mendez continued, "You even used an old regional expression that my grandmother used when I was a child. Very few people outside northwestern Spain know it today." Naomi smiled gently. "Languages are more than vocabulary," she replied. "They carry memories. If you only translate the words, you miss the people." The sentence settled over the room with more weight than any financial presentation that evening. Victor Laurent slowly placed both hands on the table and looked toward Ethan Whitmore. "That," he said calmly, "is exactly why international partnerships succeed or fail." Ethan forced another smile, but this one no longer reached his eyes. He had spent years mastering negotiations, reading balance sheets, and forecasting markets. Yet he suddenly realized that the conversation had shifted onto ground where his confidence offered no advantage. Before he could respond, another delegate quietly raised his hand. She represented a technology company from Japan and had remained mostly silent throughout dinner, carefully observing every exchange. Speaking in Japanese, she asked Naomi an unusually complex question about cultural etiquette during corporate mergers, including references to traditions that many fluent speakers outside Japan rarely understood. Naomi answered patiently, explaining not only the language itself, but also the emotional meaning behind certain expressions and why direct translations often created misunderstandings during negotiations. The Japanese executive slowly bowed her head in appreciation before switching to English. "Your explanation is more accurate than many professional consultants we have hired." The room grew even quieter. One executive discreetly lowered the tablet he had been using to review contract figures. Another stopped checking incoming messages. Even the restaurant manager standing near the entrance no longer worried about service timing because every guest had forgotten about the meal entirely. They were witnessing something no carefully planned agenda could have produced. Ethan looked around the table and noticed a subtle change that unsettled him more than anything Naomi had said. People were no longer looking at him for answers. They were looking at her. Authority had not officially changed hands, but attention had. And in rooms where billion-dollar decisions were made, attention was often the first form of power to move. Victor Laurent finally broke the silence once again. "Miss Brooks," he asked warmly, "would you mind joining us at the table for just one question?" Several executives looked surprised. Restaurant staff did not sit beside international investors. That boundary was understood without ever being written. Naomi hesitated only briefly before glancing toward the restaurant manager, who gave a small approving nod. She quietly set down the silver water pitcher that she had carried throughout the evening. For the first time since the dinner began, she stepped away from serving the table and walked toward it, unaware that the next question would reveal a truth no one in the room, especially Ethan Whitmore, had ever imagined. Naomi accepted the invitation with the same quiet composure she had carried throughout the evening. She did not rush to the empty chair beside Victor Laurent, nor did she hesitate as though she felt unworthy of sitting among executives whose companies shaped global markets. She simply thanked the manager with a respectful nod, pulled out the chair carefully, and sat with perfect posture, folding her hands gently in her lap. For a brief moment, the room felt strangely balanced. Expensive tailored suits surrounded a simple black restaurant uniform, yet confidence no longer seemed connected to clothing. Victor smiled warmly before asking the question that had been lingering in every curious mind. Miss Brooks, where did you study all these languages? Several guests leaned forward instinctively. Ethan Whitmore folded his arms once again, expecting the answer to include an Ivy League university, a prestigious scholarship, or years spent living overseas. Naomi looked down for only a heartbeat before meeting Victor's eyes. Mostly at the New York Public Library, she answered softly. The silence that followed carried a different weight than before. It was not disbelief alone. It was confusion. Victor blinked. The public library? Naomi nodded. Yes, sir. I borrowed grammar books, listened to free recordings, joined online language exchange groups after work, and practiced with anyone willing to teach me. Some days I studied before sunrise. Other days I stayed until the library closed because I could not afford the textbooks everyone else was buying. Nobody laughed. The earlier amusement had completely disappeared. One executive quietly removed his reading glasses, staring at Naomi with growing respect. She continued without the slightest trace of self-pity. When my mother became ill several years ago, she needed specialists from different countries. I realized that every new language allowed me to understand another doctor, another family, another patient sitting beside us in waiting rooms. At first I learned because I wanted to help her. Later I realized I could also help people who arrived in New York feeling completely alone because nobody understood their words. Victor listened without interrupting. Even Professor Alejandro Mendez lowered his head thoughtfully. Naomi smiled faintly as memories surfaced. On my days off, I volunteer at a community center that helps newly arrived immigrant families. Sometimes all they need is someone to explain a school form. Sometimes they need help understanding hospital instructions. Sometimes they simply need another human being willing to listen without making them feel embarrassed. Across the table, the Japanese executive slowly closed her notebook. You never studied languages for business? She asked gently. Naomi shook her head. Business came later. People came first. The sentence settled into the room with quiet force. Ethan Whitmore looked down at the untouched contract lying beside his tablet. For years, he had invested millions in technology designed to improve communication across borders. Yet the woman he had dismissed at the beginning of dinner had built something even more valuable without investors, without corporate funding, and without recognition. She had built trust one conversation at a time. Victor finally leaned back with a thoughtful smile. Miss Brooks, he said, I have attended international negotiations for more than 30 years. Tonight, you reminded every person at this table that fluency is not measured by vocabulary alone. It is measured by empathy. Around the room, heads nodded almost instinctively. Outside, the lights of Manhattan continued sparkling against the night sky, but inside the dining room, something far more important had shifted. The evening was no longer about signing the largest contract of the year. It had quietly become a lesson about the kind of intelligence that could never be printed on a diploma or measured by a job title. No one reached for the contracts anymore. The leather folders that had dominated the center of the table now rested unopened beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers, as though numbers had suddenly become less urgent than understanding the person sitting quietly among them. Ethan Whitmore looked around the room and recognized something he had rarely experienced throughout his career. He was no longer leading the conversation. Every question now drifted naturally toward Naomi, and every answer she gave seemed to draw people closer instead of pushing them away. Victor. Laurent finally broke the thoughtful silence. Miss Brooks, he said with genuine curiosity, if someone with your knowledge can communicate across so many cultures, why are you still working as a waitress? The question carried no judgment. It carried honest wonder. Naomi smiled gently before answering. Because life does not always move as quickly as talent does. Several guests exchanged quiet glances. She continued with the same calm honesty that had defined every word she spoke that evening. I applied for many positions after finishing several language certification programs. Most employers appreciated my skills during interviews. Some even called me exceptional. But opportunities often went to people with stronger connections, more recognizable schools, or resumes that looked more impressive on paper. Bills still had to be paid. My rent still arrived every month. So I accepted the work that was available while continuing to prepare for the work I hoped would come one day. There was no resentment in her voice. No bitterness. Only quiet determination. Professor Alejandro Mendez smiled with admiration. You never stopped learning. Naomi shook her head softly. No, sir. I promised myself that when opportunity finally arrived, I would not be the reason it passed me by. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the polished table. Those words settled heavily in his mind because they reminded him of something he had once believed before success had gradually replaced curiosity with certainty. Across the table, the Japanese executive opened her notebook once more. May I ask another question? Naomi nodded politely. What is the most difficult language you have ever learned? Several guests expected her to name one of the languages she had already demonstrated. Instead, she smiled almost playfully. Listening. A few people laughed quietly, assuming she was making a joke. Naomi continued before the laughter faded. Every language has grammar. Every culture has traditions. But truly listening requires humility. You have to believe another person's experience matters just as much as your own. That is much harder than memorizing vocabulary. The room fell silent again. Victor slowly nodded, recognizing the truth immediately. Ethan leaned back in his chair, remembering how quickly he had dismissed Naomi before asking a single meaningful question about her life. He had listened only long enough to confirm his own assumptions. Suddenly those assumptions felt embarrassingly small. The restaurant manager approached the table discreetly and whispered that the next course was ready to be served. Victor smiled politely, but raised one hand. Please give us a few more minutes. Even the carefully timed dinner schedule had become secondary. Then one of the legal advisors responsible for the international agreement quietly cleared her throat. There is one remaining issue before the partnership can be finalized, she said. Our newest partners insist that the closing statement be reviewed in its original multilingual draft. Unfortunately, our certified interpreter has been delayed by severe traffic and may not arrive before the signing deadline. A subtle wave of concern moved around the table. Several executives immediately checked their watches. Missing the deadline would postpone the agreement for weeks. Ethan looked toward the unopened documents, then slowly turned his eyes back to Naomi. For the first time that evening, he did not see a waitress in a black uniform. He saw the only person in the room who might quietly hold the future of a billion-dollar partnership in her hands. The atmosphere shifted so completely that even the city beyond the windows seemed quieter. Manhattan still glittered beneath the summer sky, yellow lights stretching for miles across the skyline. But inside the private dining room, every heartbeat seemed louder than the traffic below. The legal advisor carefully slid the multilingual agreement across the polished table. Hundreds of pages. Technical clauses. Shipping regulations. International compliance requirements. Every paragraph had been prepared in several languages to satisfy legal standards across multiple countries. One overlooked phrase could delay the partnership for weeks or even months. Ethan Whitmore stared at the documents before looking toward Naomi. Only a few hours earlier, he had measured her value by the tray she carried. Now he found himself asking a question he never imagined leaving his own mouth. Miss Brooks, he said quietly, his confidence replaced by sincerity. Would you be willing to help us review the translations? Naomi looked almost surprised. I am not a certified legal interpreter, she answered honestly. Then tell us when you are uncertain. Victor Laurent replied with a reassuring smile. Honesty is exactly why we trust you. Naomi nodded respectfully and moved her chair closer to the table. The thick contract was opened, and the first pages passed before her. She read carefully, never rushing, her eyes moving steadily between English, French, Japanese, Mandarin, German, Spanish, Portuguese, and Arabic. She did not perform for the room. She simply worked. Every few pages she paused, pointing gently to small differences that most people would have overlooked. One sentence translated as obligation instead of responsibility. Another paragraph unintentionally softened an important liability clause in one language while strengthening it in another. A cultural expression used in the Japanese draft sounded unnecessarily direct for a formal corporate agreement. The Brazilian Portuguese version contained a phrase that local executives might interpret differently during future negotiations. Naomi explained each issue calmly, offering alternatives while carefully respecting the legal intent behind every section. The attorneys immediately compared her observations with the original drafts. One after another, every correction proved accurate. The room filled not with applause, but with something even more meaningful. Respect. Pens began moving, unnecessary confusion for years. Tonight those mistakes were prevented by someone who was never invited to this meeting. Nobody argued. Nobody needed to. Ethan slowly stood from his chair. The room instinctively followed his movement, expecting another business announcement. Instead, he looked directly at Naomi, his voice noticeably softer than it had been all evening. "I owe you an apology." The words settled into the room with remarkable simplicity. "When you first spoke tonight, I assumed your uniform told me everything I needed to know about you. I never asked who you were. I only decided who I thought you were." Naomi remained silent, allowing him to finish. Ethan took a slow breath before continuing. "That was my mistake, not yours." Around the table, several executives quietly nodded. Victor Laurent smiled with quiet satisfaction, but before anyone could return to discussing signatures and closing schedules, Professor Alejandro Mendez leaned forward with a thoughtful expression. Looking first at Naomi, then at Ethan, he spoke with calm certainty. "The contract may be ready to sign now," he said, "but I believe the most important agreement reached tonight was not written on any of these pages. It happened the moment one person finally chose to see another clearly." The signatures came one after another, each stroke of ink carrying the weight of years of planning, months of negotiations, and countless flights across oceans. Yet everyone seated around the table understood that the evening would be remembered for something entirely different. It would not be remembered because a billion-dollar partnership had finally been approved. It would be remembered because assumptions had quietly fallen apart in the presence of truth. As the final document was signed, Victor Laurent rose from his chair and extended his hand to Ethan Whitmore. "Congratulations," he said warmly. Meetings had never unsettled him. Speaking to investors had always come naturally. Yet offering a sincere apology required a different kind of courage. "Miss Brooks," he began, "I built my company believing that talent should always be rewarded. Tonight I realized something uncomfortable. Sometimes I only recognized talent when it arrived wearing the clothes I expected." Naomi looked at him with the same calm expression she had worn since the evening began. Greater, the respect of every person in the room. As she walked calmly toward the service station, nobody saw a waitress disappearing into the background anymore. They saw a woman whose dignity had never depended on a title, whose intelligence had never needed permission, and whose kindness had quietly translated far more than words. Because wealth can open doors, power can fill a room, but respect is the one language every heart understands. And on that unforgettable night, it was not the millionaire who taught the greatest lesson. It was the woman everyone almost failed to notice.